Hey there everybody, I'm the Disney Guy, and it took a little while, but we finally made it through the transitional era.
And what a long, strange era it's been. Stretching from Robin Hood in 1973 to Oliver and Company in 1988, the transitional era features 7 movies that really illustrate how much the company was changing as they tried to find their way post-Walt. In fact, some people actually call this time in Disney history the Dark Ages. And while I try not to be as doom and gloom about it, as I do think there were plenty of positives to go with the negatives of this era, particularly when you compare these films to the ones released before it in the Golden Age and after it in the Renaissance, I can certainly see where that Dark Ages moniker comes from.
And I suppose that the term Dark Ages does pair a little bit better with the Renaissance that comes after it, but that's neither here nor there.
It almost makes it difficult in a way to really generalize similar characteristics of all the films in this era, as between the different staffs working on them and the different regimes heading them, the films in this era had almost more differences than similarities. And over this tumultuous 15-year period, you can actually see Disney hurtling towards the future, from little things such as how their soundtracks are constructed, to big things such as the advent of CGI.
What I'm trying to say is these movies are so different from one another, and even elements like art style change so much that it's actually kind of hard to compare them to figure out which ones I liked more or less. But I've never been one to shy away from a challenge, so with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the high and low points of the transitional era.
So let's start with an easy one, my favorite character of the transitional era, and that's Winnie-the-Pooh from The Many Adventures of Winnie-the-Pooh. So The Many Adventures of Winnie-the-Pooh is kind of the black sheep of this era, as it's technically the only film in this era that was worked on under Walt, seeing as each element of the film was originally released as shorts back in the 60s and 70s. But with the full-length feature film being released in 1977, it still counts as part of the transitional era, so that's good enough for me.
Plus, it gives me another excuse to talk about Winnie-the-Pooh, which I will always take.
I've said this numerous times on this channel, but it does bear repeating once more. No pun intended. For me, Winnie-the-Pooh equals childhood. There's an innocence and naivety about him that I've always found to be charming, and I can't help but to just have a smile on my face and enjoy whenever I see Pooh on screen. Pooh is also a weirdly versatile character, even within the same movie, as he can be an oblivious agitator when it comes to his dealings with Rabbit, but also plays a pretty good straight man against Tigger's antics. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some other highly enjoyable characters for me in this era. Basil and Dodger in particular come to mind, and there's even another character who I love in this same movie, Tigger. But for me, Pooh just stands out above all the rest, particularly because of his impact on the film itself, but also, admittedly, partially due to my own nostalgic bias.
And once more, just for emphasis, me, 21, hugging Pooh. I just love that silly old bear.
But of course, talking about just the good guys is only half the fun, as the transitional era actually had its fair share of pretty nasty baddies. There's the duo of Prince John and the Sheriff in Robin Hood, who, although very different characters, are equally as devious and entertaining to watch. You have Madame Medusa, who may very well be a Cruella de Vil clone, but hey, who doesn't love them some Cruella de Vil? But my favorite villain in this era has to be Professor Ratigan from The Great Mouse Detective. As I said in my review, I honestly never gave too much thought to Ratigan in the past, as The Great Mouse Detective wasn't a movie I really grew up on as a kid. But boy had I been missing out. His character is just so entertaining, especially his desire to be this smart, sophisticated villain when really he's just a brutish rat. But I think my favorite part about Ratigan is how he plays off the protagonist, Basil. Their scenes together are my favorite in the movie, and the cat and mouse game they play,
Or I suppose more accurately, rat and mouse game, but who's counting?
is some of the most enjoyable stuff in this entire era for me. But more than just Ratigan's character, it's his voice actor, Vincent Price, with his energetic, over-the-top performance that probably puts this villain over the top. But really, when it comes down to it, I just love it when Ratigan is nasty.
Ratigan also sings one of the funniest songs in the entire era with Goodbye So Soon. But does that make it the best song of the era?
Well, frankly, no, though it was wildly entertaining, which is in contrast to a problem I found throughout this era. There just weren't a ton of memorable songs, and some films, such as The Black Cauldron, didn't even have lyrical songs in them at all. But But despite this, there was one song that stood out above the rest, and that's Why Should I Worry from Oliver & Company. The song is an unbelievably catchy earworm, and it's such a refreshing and vibrant change of pace when compared to a lot of the slow and forgettable songs in the years prior. The song's fun and upbeat nature is a perfect representation of the character singing it, Dodger, as well as the city itself that the song is referring to, New York. It's a song that has the ability to stand alone on its own as a single, and a lot of that, of course, can be attributed to the song's singer, Billy Joel.
In fact, Why Should I Worry is one of a host of great songs found in Oliver & Company. Which sounds like a perfect segue into talking about the best soundtrack of the era.
So yeah, Oliver & Company is absolutely one of the best soundtracks of the entire era. But although I wasn't super fond of a lot of the individual songs of the era, the nature of the overall soundtracks was a bit closer to call. The musical scores from films such as The Black Cauldron and The Great Mouse Detective are pretty great, and in fact Great Mouse Detective has one of my favorite non-lyrical songs of the era with Big Ben Chase. But in the end, I actually have to declare a draw for best soundtrack between The Many Adventures of Winnie-the-Pooh and Oliver & Company. Yes, these soundtracks are very different, but that's kind of the point. The Many Adventures of Winnie-the-Pooh, in my opinion, is the best soundtrack among the more classical style of Disney soundtracks, whereas Oliver & Company is the first in what I feel was the superior modern style of Disney soundtracks. Both are great for entirely different reasons, with Winnie-the-Pooh's soundtrack being charming and dotted with some great Sherman Brothers tunes, while Oliver & Company was built with the idea of being a pop album, an idea that I think paid off in its quality.
So is calling it a draw a bit of a cop-out? Yeah, but one, it is my list after all, and two, both soundtracks are so great, but they're so different that they really are hard to compare and contrast, so why not just celebrate them both?
Of course, I love looking into the background stories behind the makings of these films on this channel, and although the Transitional Era did have some of the more forgettable films in Disney history, it wasn't short on drama behind the scenes. In fact, a major theme of this era as a whole was turnover and behind-the-scenes tensions, and there were multiple films that saw the production cycles completely bogged down with the backstage drama. But the king of the behind-the-scenes turmoil had to be The Fox and the Hound. This production cycle just had a bit of everything. A battle between old and new, leading to a shift in power at the top with the younger animators effectively pushing out Wolfgang Reitherman, major story debates and changes in regards to the fate of Chief, and even a major departure of talent with Don Bluth's Exodus coming midway through the production, delaying its release date.
And although I would argue that the era's biggest behind-the-scenes moment, the installation of Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg, did come after The Fox and the Hound, the film's troubled production cycle was just the perfect embodiment of all of the problems going on at the Disney studio during a time when they really were just trying to find their way again.
And with a lot of behind-the-scenes turmoil comes some underwhelming films, as the Transitional Era certainly had a couple of those. But although I will concede that a film such as, say, Robin Hood, with its arguably overly simplistic plot and abundance of reused animation, isn't exactly a great Disney film, I still at least find some entertainment and nuggets of good in it. But as for my least favorite film of the era, The Black Cauldron, I just think it's legitimately a bad movie. I went into a ton of detail about my problems with the film in my review, but the spark notes is this: the pace is rushed, the plot has far too many unanswered questions, and ultimately the characters and story are just bland. I think what makes it worse for me, though, is that this was originally supposed to be this new generation's Snow White, and there was definitely a lot of potential here with strong source material and a really cool and scary villain, but partially due to some behind-the-scenes issues and partially due to just some bad decision-making, the film became ultimately forgettable in the pantheon of Disney films, and it's almost universally regarded as one of Disney's worst efforts in this or any era.
Though, believe it or not, The Black Cauldron actually isn't my least favorite Disney animated film of all time. Trust me, we'll get to that one soon enough. But enough of all this negativity, let's move on to my favorite film of the Transitional Era.
Despite all the behind-the-scenes problems and staff turnover, there were still a few gems that got released during this era. The Many Adventures of Winnie-the-Pooh is a heartfelt reminder of classic Disney. The Rescuers is one of the better adventure films that Disney's ever released and a strong standby for me when I want to just sit back and enjoy a quality movie. And The Great Mouse Detective is arguably one of the more underrated films in Disney history, and the start of a wonderful partnership between John Musker and Ron Clements. But the transitional era film that will always stand out among the rest for me is Oliver and Company. Yeah, it's probably a fairly obvious choice with how much I've talked about it, but I really do love this film. Does it have its flaws? Of course, but let's be honest, most of the movies in this era have some glaring flaws in them. It's the film's strengths, though, a strong and funny overall cast, a great soundtrack featuring catchy songs, and fun and lively animation that far outweigh its weaknesses. And ultimately, Oliver and Company felt to me like Renaissance Light in a way. The first movie to truly embrace the modern direction that film was heading, and help set the company's course in what would be their most productive era, financially and creatively, in nearly 40 years. Look, the transitional era is definitely one of the more forgettable times in Disney history, as it was a period of time when it didn't feel like Disney Animation knew what it wanted to be. But when you look at this era as a whole, from where it started to where it ended, it is kind of fascinating to see the changes and improvements from its beginning to end. So although the transitional era is generally regarded as Disney's dark age, I would argue that without the experimentation and even some of the failures of this era, Disney would never be able to achieve the heights it would soar to just one era later.
Well, guys, that wraps it up for me this week. Hope you all enjoyed, and let me know what your highs and lows for the transitional era were. Also, some personal news, I've actually launched my second channel on here on YouTube, JTDG Gaming, which link for that will be found in the description below. Basically, it's going to be a channel where we do some Let's Plays, and if you're interested in things like Kingdom Hearts, it's a good place to check out to see a different style of video and some more content from me. So please check that out in the description below, and if you're interested, give us a subscribe, it'll be a big help. Also, be sure to subscribe to this channel. Follow me on Twitter for all updates with myself and the channel. Also be sure to check out my Patreon to find out some exclusive perks, including some about that new channel, as well as find other ways to help build and grow this channel. And I will see you all real soon.
I'll say so long and go so soon.